What is going on, everyone? So in this week's video, I want to talk about visual tension, which is an aspect of composition, and it's one that I actively consider when I establish a composition, because there are some times when some aspects of composition is just, you know what, when you see it, you don't really think through the process, but visual tension is one of the things that I do deliberate quite a bit in the field. And as a result, oftentimes when I take a photo, I don't feel the need to crop anything afterwards, because at least in my opinion, if you find yourself cropping significantly after the fact, or even just doing a subtle crop, it means that there's something you didn't notice in the field and something that you perhaps could have avoided. So visual tension has to do with the spatial arrangement of objects within a composition in relation to each other, as well as in relation to the edges of the frame. And if you have increased visual tension, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can very much be a good thing. But for the type of photography that I do, I have very calm subjects. I'm trying to portray a sense of calm. And so I oftentimes try to minimize visual tension to have that calm feeling in the images. So I have a bunch of examples here I'm going to show you. I'm going to talk through the compositions and the thought process that I used in the field for them. And hopefully this will be pretty helpful. So let's start with this image right here. So we have this oak leaf in a sandy wash taken in the shade, so you get a little bit of this cool color cast. And you'll see that I chose to center this leaf within the composition. Now, the reason for that is that the center of the composition is oftentimes an area that has the least amount of visual tension. It portrays a very calm feeling, which is exactly what I wanted to have here. The background has this sort of soothing bluish tone from the sand in shadow. We have all these repeating patterns, which is also a bit soothing. The leaf is rather symmetrical, and symmetrical subjects do quite well in the center. And so by placing this right in the middle, we have a lessened amount of visual tension. Now, what would happen if I had this leaf positioned close to the edge? It would become an eye magnet. It would increase the visual tension, and it would go against the feeling that I wanted to have. And what's even worse is, what if we had this leaf right down here in the corner? The corners have the most visual tension. And so by having it right in the middle, it gives a nice calm feeling. Let's look at another example here. So here we have a little more going on in the scene. Again, I do want to portray a sense of calm, which is going to come through because we also have this cool color palette of the ice. We have a lot of other elements going on here. So we do have the leaf, but we have all these other lines and shapes and everything else going on. And with this one, I decided to have the leaf in this lower corner, and this leaf is frozen within the ice itself. And so with this, I want to have a little bit of visual tension between this leaf and the rest of the frame, but I want you guys to notice something in particular about this. And this is something that I made sure to do in the field. If you look at this distance here and that distance there, they're going to be about the same. And so even though we have this leaf going more towards that corner, we have equal spacing there and there. And if this leaf started getting a little bit closer to the bottom, and this distance was dramatically different from that distance, we would increase that visual tension. So we do have a little bit more visual tension with here, but it's because we have this and these elements that are balanced. When people talk about the rule of thirds, they oftentimes don't talk about what it is that's actually going on with that. This does happen to be right in there. It's because it's that sweet spot in visual tension between the center, which has very low visual tension, and the corner, which has extreme visual tension. So it hits that nice sort of midpoint there, which has just a nice bit of dynamic motion there. Let's look at this one. So here we have a canyon scene in Death Valley, and this is one that is a very simple image on first glance, but there's a lot of debating I did on this one when setting up this composition. So I want you to look at actually this distance here, which is about the same as that distance there, about the same distance as that distance there, and that distance there. So on this one, I was moving the camera side to side and trying to figure out how to balance these elements within the frame. And because there's going to be some visual tension created by this dark wall and this light wall here, but I was actually on the ground glass using my fingers and measuring the distances there in a way that would kind of balance things a little bit. So that's one of the things that is nice about working with large format, because I have this really big screen I'm working with, and I will actually use my fingers to measure things. So I'm very precise in the way that I place the camera and the way that I compose the photo. This is another example of that. Whoops, as I drop it here. So a picture of some salt flats in Death Valley. And with this one, I want you to pay attention to the spacing below this salt formation, to the right of the salt formation, and over here. So this distance, let me see if I can do this. This distance there, there, and there, all pretty similar, with a little bit less over here. But again, it has to do with making sure that there is enough spacing around there and there and there to reduce any sort of visual tension. Because if you start having not enough foreground, your eyes can go right to this area here along the bottom edge. So by reducing the visual tension in the foreground, the story now becomes this compared to that. And that's where the story of the image becomes. This one here is a little bit more tricky. If you take a really close look at this one, you'll notice that that rock, well, first of all, it's not centered, up and down. I have it weighted towards the higher end of the frame, but look at it in comparison to left and right. That distance is not the same as that distance. We have some other factors at play here, which is this trail coming out from that rock, which has a little bit of an emphasis moving this way. So I have this rock positioned a little bit more to the left in the frame. But when I was composing this one originally, I was trying to figure out how to compose this so that I would minimize the visual tension within the frame. And I found that having it higher in the frame and a little bit to the left was the best way to minimize the visual tension and allow room for this trail of the rock there. This one I did have to crop a little bit because I wasn't quite convinced when I was composing it. I didn't quite have the rock high enough in the frame. So I actually cropped it to move that rock a little bit higher up in the frame. And I had a feeling that that was going to be the case. But for some reason it didn't quite look right in the field. But my initial hunch was correct with regard to that. So sometimes having something not be centered, even if it's just off by a little bit, is going to be as a result of other elements within the frame. Here's one on a similar note, and if you were to take a look at this, that distance there is not, well, it's a little hard to show it here, but it's not, this bush is not perfectly centered within the frame. And yet it still has a feeling of calm. What I was working with in terms of the visual element that was, well, the element I was working with was really just this triangular shape back here. In this case, that distance there is about the same as that distance there. Because I found that having this centered was actually not quite, it didn't reduce the visual tension enough, but having this element here, which is, that is the one that actually was more important to have centered. So sometimes having an element that's a little bit off center is more visually, you reduce the visual tension because of other elements within the frame, if that makes sense. Now this one here, we have this large boulder, smaller boulder, and then these other large boulders that it's stuck between. I want you to take a look at that distance there, which is the same as that distance there, which is the same as that distance there. So I have these rocks spatially arranged within this composition so that we have equal spacing between them, so that it reduces the visual tension between those. And one very important element in this one is this diagonal. So take a look at that line there and that line there, which gets to another very important aspect of visual tension, which as I mentioned earlier, has to do with the corners. If you have a subject, a line, especially this or this, if this was emanating from that corner, that would be an eye magnet. That would increase the visual tension. So by having that miss the corner is extremely important because it immediately reduces the visual tension. There's enough tension in this image because of the diagonals, but by having everything arranged at just the right distance, that helps to give it a bit more of a sense of calm. It can still be dynamic, but it can be calm. And that is a principle on this one as well. Look at where that crack goes. It does not go to the corner. We have this cactus pushed down into the corner a bit more, so it's creating some visual tension because we're getting a little closer to those edges, but that's the whole point of it. It becomes a story of this cactus and then this crack. So we have I'm trying to keep the distance somewhat similar, there, and there. By pushing this into the corner, it becomes a bit more dynamic. By having this crack not come from this corner, it becomes a bit of a stronger composition. But look at that spot right there. That top part of the cactus, that crack right there, that space between them. I tried to make sure when I was composing this that there was enough of a gap there, but there was still enough to have the tension created by this element within the frame right here. And so that's the thing where as you get better with composition, you know those things that you're looking for that would become a little bit of a distraction, and you can position the camera in just the way so that this doesn't overlap that and you have just enough space there. And I'm intentionally trying to create some tension with this image. Another example here. So if we look at the distance of, or the size of this boulder, is basically the same as that. But on this one, what I want to show you is that this space right here, and then that space right there. So I position the camera at such that that space and that space are equal. These rocks are visually the same. And I'm trying to minimize any sort of visual tension with regard to the elements within the frame. This tree is not centered, but it's positioned in a way that gives it some space to breathe. And it's a matter of positioning the camera a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, so that it is at just the right angle. And our final image, when I was composing this one, see if you can figure out what it was that I was trying to accomplish with my exact placement of the camera. See if you can spot the potential area of visual tension that I tried to minimize a bit. If you guessed right there, you're right. So I was looking at that branch, those leaves on that slope of sandstone right there. And I'm trying to make sure that it doesn't go right up to the edge of it or just barely cross over it. I want to have a little bit of breathing room right there, which gives the overall image a little bit of breathing room. Down here, the root in the proximity to the edge of the frame is another point. Not quite as important as up there. I just try to give it enough breathing room down below there. So visual tension is one of those things that as you're composing a photo, you really need to pay attention to those things. And it's one of the things where if a photo doesn't look quite right, and then if you find that cropping it just a little bit after the fact suddenly makes it better, there's probably something that you were not completely aware of when you're composing it. And I get it, it can be difficult when looking through a viewfinder. I have the advantage of working on a big ground glass where I'm actually measuring things and trying to get things to be just right. But I think a lot of it is just to have that added awareness as you're setting up a composition. And if you find that you don't need to crop your images, if you find that you're quite happy with them after the fact, it probably means that you're paying a little bit more attention as you're composing them. Maybe it's moving your camera just a little bit one way, a little bit the other way. But it's one of those things I definitely consider when I'm out setting up a composition. But I want to thank everyone for watching, and we'll see you around next time.